There was no press spray, no choreographed handshake, and no comforting background noise of the White House press corps. Instead, behind tightly closed doors, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir waited silently past their scheduled appointment, the clock ticking, the message unmistakable. President Trump was orchestrating a scene that, for those who understand the inner workings of power, said more than any statement released to the media ever could. Leverage is everything, and in 2025, U.S.-Pakistan relations had entered a new transactional phase. This was not a one-off event or a casual diplomatic outreach. It represented the culmination of months of accelerated engagement, a series of meetings, investments, tactical pauses, and moments of high drama shaped by crises and opportunities. But this moment was different. It signaled that the logic of negotiation had shifted for both sides, away from hollow promises and symbolic gestures toward concrete, measurable outcomes. To understand why this transformation matters, we need to travel back through the cycles of Pakistan-United States relations and take stock of the changes remaking South Asia's balance of power. U.S.-Pakistan ties have never been consistent. They have been sharp, spasmodic, the relationship alternately surging into overdrive in moments of mutual need, only to plunge into periods of deep distrust and strategic divorce. Across decades, conspiracies and calculations, euphorias and betrayals, the relationship has always been shaped by two stark realities: geography and interests. What has changed in 2025 is not the geography, but the interests, and how openly both sides now pursue them. A brief history: the patterns of U.S.-Pakistan ties. The late 20th century saw Pakistan positioned as a critical U.S. ally in the region, especially during the Cold War. Through the 1950s and 1960s, military training, arms shipments, and mutual defense pacts with the United States helped Islamabad build an army and air force unmatched in South Asia outside India. This arrangement was purely instrumental, spurred by the U.S. desire to contain Soviet influence in neighboring Afghanistan and project power into the broader Middle East. However, the intensity of this partnership was as much a reflection of strategic necessity as of real trust. U.S. enthusiasm for Pakistan ebbed and flowed. When new opportunities for cooperation emerged, like the Afghan jihad against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, Pakistan became invaluable as a staging ground, logistics base, and intelligence partner. Massive funds flowed through the ISI into the Mujahideen networks, a decision that shaped the region for generations. But the relationship was always transactional, and by the early 1990s, the alliance faced sharp downturns, especially after the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan and revelations about Pakistan's clandestine nuclear program. When interests no longer aligned, sanctions replaced subsidies, vitriol grew where there had been photo ops. This cycle reinforced the lesson: U.S.-Pakistan ties are only as durable as their mutual benefits. Then came the attacks of September 11, 2001. Over the next 2 decades, the global war on terror once again thrust Pakistan into the role of major non-NATO ally. Billions of dollars in military and civilian aid flowed into the country, and with them a new cycle of dependency and disappointment. The U.S. military relied on Pakistan for logistics, overflight rights, and counter-terrorism intelligence. In return, Islamabad leveraged U.S. needs, sometimes facilitating cooperation, at other times using ambiguity as a bargaining tool, particularly as U.S. conduct in Afghanistan grew more controversial and costly. From the Khyber Pass to the corridors of Rawalpindi, Washington's interest waxed and waned according to short-term requirements and long-term frustrations. Attempts to turn the relationship into a values-based alliance quickly withered against the deeper, transactional impulses that always returned at moments of crisis. Entering the 2020s, new stakes, old patterns. By 2025, 3 distinct vectors converged to create the current phase of U.S.-Pakistan bargaining: security access, contested geography, and resource diplomacy. First, the abrupt collapse of the U.S.-backed government in Afghanistan and the Taliban's imposition of strict, not an inch sovereignty forced Washington to look for new contingency and intelligence options. Bagram Air Base, once the crown jewel of U.S. military infrastructure in the region, was off-limits following years of blood, treasure, and geopolitical wrangling. U.S. planners couldn't privilege nostalgia over reality, so regional alternatives, including Pakistani air corridors, rotational access, and logistics flexibility, became essential. Pakistan's utility thus surged once more, just as it had in decades past, not because Washington loved Islamabad, but because other options dried up. Second, the region was in flux. India's military modernization, China's massive economic corridors and port investments, especially at Gwadar, and Iran's regional maneuvering all complicated U.S. interests. Stability in South Asia was no longer simply about terrorism, but about controlling the flows of resources, critical minerals, and energy that powered the world. This meant that whoever managed the ports, pipelines, mines, and trade corridors would in effect write the region's rules. Finally, Pakistan itself faced immediate financial pressure. Years of economic mismanagement, climate shocks, energy shortfalls, mounting debt, and IMF stringency created an urgent need for direct foreign investment and access to U.S. markets. At the same time, the political temperature in Islamabad was rising. Opposition parties accused the government of selling the country, while the military, as always, remained the real center of gravity in negotiations with foreign partners. The Trump presidency, new style, familiar strategy. Donald Trump's return to the White House ushered in an even more transactional phase in U.S. foreign policy, and with it, a new approach to South Asia. Where previous administrations had balanced public lectures about democracy with covert intelligence bargains, Trump's approach was direct, personal, and visible. Every deal measured in dollars, every handshake weighed for immediate advantage. The meetings between Trump, Sharif, and Munir were thus a logical outcome. They reflected both the gravity of the issues at stake, U.S. contingency planning, Pakistan's economic survival, and the new style of international bargaining that the Trump era epitomized. The secrecy, the waiting, the lack of public readouts. These were not signs of diplomatic dysfunction, but of very deliberate realpolitik. As the 2020s unfold, resource diplomacy has become the beating heart of Pakistan's efforts to reshape its relations with great powers. The need is urgent. Pakistan's mineral deposits, especially copper, gold, antimony, and rare earth elements, are now central to global industrial and defense supply chains. The United States, anxious to secure resilient sources beyond China, has shown keen interest in Pakistani concessions. In July 2025, after extensive back-channel discussions, the headline emerged. The U.S. would steer a $500 million investment into development of Pakistani critical minerals. The deal was neither accidental nor purely economic. It represented a calculated recognition that minerals are geopolitical assets, not just economic ones. How the deal was structured. Here is how such resource deals work. U.S. companies propose phased investments tied explicitly to project milestones: exploration, extraction, processing, and export. Pakistan, in turn, sets terms for royalties, local content, environmental standards, and price hedging. U.S. capital flows in tranches, each contingent on regulatory stability and the absence of political backsliding. Dispute resolution is mapped to international arbitration bodies, not local courts. Crucially, offtake agreements give U.S. parties access to predictable supply while linking Pakistan's revenue to global market prices through sophisticated financial instruments. These terms are technical, but in a region scarred by broken contracts and resource nationalism, technical details are the difference between success and collapse. For Islamabad, this investment serves as far more than a revenue stream. It creates a narrative of global validation. The presence of U.S. capital and technology confers legitimacy with multilateral lenders like the IMF and World Bank, thereby unlocking secondary flows of credit and investment. For local communities, though, the risks remain: environmental degradation, profit repatriation that drains local wealth, and the threat of social unrest if benefits do not flow equitably. Thus, Pakistani negotiators seek ring-fenced local content provisions and community development funds as part of the deal. Energy diplomacy, the second pillar. Alongside minerals, energy is at the center of Islamabad's negotiation playbook. The country's massive energy deficit, especially in electricity generation and affordable imports, makes it vulnerable to both short-term shocks and long-term development constraints. By 2025, the Trump administration had signaled keen interest in upstream oil and gas exploration. Pakistan's hope: move from dependency on imports and subsidies to self-sufficiency via Western technology and joint ventures. A typical energy bargain runs as follows. Islamabad opens bidding for seismic surveys, drilling rights, and enhanced recovery technology. U.S. companies bring in capital, kit, and management expertise. Pakistan, however, must guarantee security for field teams, regulatory predictability, and payment discipline. LNG deals come with the promise of reliable supply and regasification infrastructure, floating terminals, pipeline upgrades, but also with exposure to GL. Oil price swings and commodity risk. The politics of energy reform are fraught. Subsidy withdrawals, tariff hikes, and currency reforms inevitably stir unrest among domestic stakeholders. Opposition leaders frame every Western energy deal as selling sovereignty. Government officials counter by pointing to growing capacity and reduced import reliance. In reality, the effectiveness of these deals will depend as much on implementation as negotiation. Past failures, corruption, and regulatory bottlenecks have scuttled previous rounds of energy cooperation. Security bargains without formal bases. With Afghanistan's Taliban rulers publicly rejecting U.S. requests to return to Bagram and making clear the inviolability of Afghan territory, the United States has had to rethink its entire approach to regional security basing. The current answer: focus on discrete, reversible arrangements with neighbors. Pakistan is the logical first partner. These arrangements include overflight rights, allowing U.S. drones, ISR platforms, and military aircraft to use Pakistani air corridors on time-bound, emergency, or multinational missions. These permissions are withheld from public scrutiny and often come with strict limitations. Logistics access, episodic approvals for ground-based medevac, emergency recovery operations, and rapid deployment in case of crises. No permanent U.S. footprint, but a formalized protocol for responding to regional emergencies. Intelligence sharing, joint targeting cells, regular exchanges of signals intelligence, biometrics, and human intelligence feeds. These arrangements are codified in operational protocols and subject to regular review by both military and civilian leaders. For Pakistan, these negotiations are delicate. The military and intelligence establishment must insulate decision-making from domestic blowback. The government must justify engagement in terms of tangible benefits, aid, investment, security developments. U.S. negotiators seek reversibility in case political winds shift, and deniability, so agreements can be implemented without local media or political uproar. Trade and tariff engineering, paving the way for commercial bargains. Tariffs and trade arrangements serve as the glue holding this complex bargain together. U.S. tariff relief for Pakistani textiles, IT services, agribusiness, and medical instruments increases access to the world's largest consumer market. In exchange, Washington seeks specific deliverables: resource concessions, counter-terrorism steps, regulatory modernization, and regional security cooperation. At the same time, U.S. pressure on India, through WTO disputes or targeted trade measures, sends signals, not strategies, but they matter for regional perception. For New Delhi, every U.S.-Pakistan thaw is scrutinized through the lens of security rivalry, historical memory, Kargil, Balakot, and great power balancing. The Trump administration seeks to manage Indian discontent by ramping up parallel cooperation, defense sales, tech transfer, disaster relief, and Indo-Pacific strategy consultations. Counterterrorism, joint action, mutual suspicion. The counterterrorism file remains evergreen and contested. Every U.S. administration seeks from Pakistan decisive moves against cross-border terrorist networks, facilitators, and ideological spoilers. In 2025, the technology for counterterrorism has changed dramatically. Drones, open-source signals, and real-time targeting cells make cooperation both easier and more precise. Yet the risks remain: mutual suspicion, operational gaps, and the ever-present risk that joint action becomes fodder for political attack. Pakistan's response is typically calibrated: increased counterterrorism effort, arrests, intelligence sharing, surveillance action for decreased exposure to sanctions, improved access to export licenses, and visible investment dividends. The U.S. side codifies commitments in special working groups, monthly review sessions, and joint targeting frameworks. The success of these mechanisms depends entirely on the political will and personnel assigned. Navigating domestic political minefields. Both sides face volatile internal political dynamics. In Islamabad, opposition politicians and civil society activists accuse the government of trading sovereignty for short-term cash. The military walks a tightrope, seeking to maximize strategic gains while keeping domestic scrutiny at arm's length. In Washington, members of Congress, think tanks, and intelligence officials parse every move for signs of strategic drift or risk. In Pakistan, the optics of leaders waiting outside the Oval Office carry meaning. Some see a message about leverage. The U.S. sets the terms, Pakistan seeks flexibility. Others worry about humiliation or loss of agency. The challenge for leaders is to translate these visuals into tangible gains, investments, relief, security benefits that outlast any news cycle. In Washington, the Trump style is visible. The photo ops are sparing, deals are measured in dollars, praise is instrumental, great guys, and commitments are transactional. This posturing is the outer face of a deeper logic. Every engagement must deliver measurable returns, not just rhetorical victories. Where previous presidents balanced values and interests, the new norm is pure advantage calculus. The India-Pakistan crisis ladder, diplomacy and de-escalation. In South Asia, crises do not just test national resolve, they test global strategies. The India-Pakistan military confrontation earlier in 2025 was one of the region's sharpest in years. A series of airspace violations and standoff posturing unleashed days of skirmishes, tactical air deployments, and missile readiness. Global markets trembled, and memories of 2019's Balakot episode came flooding back. For both Washington and Beijing, the prospect of uncontrolled escalation was a nightmare scenario. Amid this tension, back-channel diplomacy became essential. Islamabad credited the Trump White House with helping ladder down the crisis, steering both sides towards restraint. This was not simply a matter of phone calls or discreet envoys. It was a tightly managed sequence of technical exchanges, intelligence deconfliction, and hotline activations under military supervision. When the dust settled, Pakistan moved quickly to parlay its public gratitude into new economic and security contacts. The end result: crisis management transformed into leverage for resource bargains, counter-terrorism collaboration, and contingency access agreements. India, meanwhile, remains deeply suspicious of any U.S.-Pakistan intimacy. Official briefings frame Washington's outreach as focused on counter-terrorism and resilient supply chains, not military balancing or U-turns on defense arrangements. Yet in strategic circles, every handshake is filtered through the lens of rivalry, Kargil, Siachen, Canal water wars, and the larger Indo-Pacific chessboard. The Trump administration calms anxieties by ramping up parallel Indo-US defense co-production, joint exercises, maritime surveillance support, and direct technology transfers. There is no rupture, but there is also no scope for complacency. Bagram Air Base, symbolism and realities of refusal. Bagram was not merely a military hub. It was the physical embodiment of America's decades-old wager on Afghan stability. Situated in the plain north of Kabul, Bagram's parallel runways, deep hardened bunkers, and city-sized logistics spine allowed the U.S. to project power at speed. From surveillance drones to airlifted SOF teams, Bagram was indispensable for counter-terrorism, humanitarian operations, and rapid regional response. So when the Taliban rulers responded to US overtures with a direct, not an inch rebuff, the landscape of US security planning changed overnight. The political logic is simple. Any public base or formal US presence in Afghanistan is toxic, both for reasons of sovereignty and for the Taliban's narrative of victory. Operationally, this means every intelligence, resupply, or emergency rescue mission must now launch from the periphery. Pakistan, by virtue of geography, existing infrastructure, and trusted military interlocutors, became the linchpin for emergency contingency options. Whether for drone overflight, ISR missions, search and rescue readiness, or indirect logistical corridors, Pakistan's proximity is irreplaceable. The challenge: all arrangements must be covert, reversible, and deniable, lest either party's domestic critics weaponize cooperation. Gwadar Port, fact versus viral disinformation. Among the many rumors spawned in the age of social media, one has proven particularly persistent: the claim that Pakistan handed over an island to China on a 1,000-year lease. There is no credible evidence for this assertion. Fact-checkers and maritime analysts all point to the reality. The only major enduring concession is Gwadar Port, granted to China Overseas Ports Holding Company in 2015 for a 43-year lease, focused on building and running the port and adjacent free trade zone. Gwadar is commercially vital, strategically located for China's Belt and Road ambitions, and symbolically pivotal for Islamabad's bid to attract long-term foreign direct investment. The arrangement is not a sovereignty transfer, but a commercial management and revenue-sharing contract, consistent with port operation deals in Sri Lanka, Greece, and elsewhere. Why do such rumors stick? Partly as a function of domestic political posturing, Pakistan is selling itself for loans, partly as part of regional disinformation campaigns, and partly due to the opacity that surrounds many foreign investments. For serious analysts, the only path forward is to rely on contract documents, maritime law precedents, and official registry filings. Open source intelligence, the new lens on realpolitik. In the modern era, OSINT, open source intelligence, is the backbone of tracking covert and overt moves in diplomacy and defense. Analysts leverage real-time flight trackers to confirm the arrival of VIPs, satellite imagery to observe new mining exploration, customs data to monitor exports of minerals and textiles, and local media signals to parse announcements around contract tenders or joint ventures. The arrival of US military aircraft at Pakistani airbases is no longer invisible. Enthusiasts and professionals alike watch ADSB broadcasts and satellite imagery. Mineral block tenders, environmental clearance notices, and government gazettes are parsed for signs of foreign investment or change in regulatory regime. Energy projects, seismic surveys, floating LNG terminals, contract awards are tracked by mapping investments and operational updates in corporate disclosures. This distributed real-time verification ensures that behind every diplomatic rumor or headline, there are hard facts against which claims can be tested. Regional impacts, immediate effects, and long-term trajectories. Pakistan's internal debate, the public rhetoric around selling sovereignty and handing over resources to foreigners, is intense. Civil society groups warn about environmental degradation, lack of local benefit sharing, and profit repatriation. Political opponents seize on every US handshake as evidence of state weakness. Strategic realities. For Rawalpindi and Islamabad, these deals bring essential cash, technology, and diplomatic leverage, but also expose the country to new risks: regulatory disputes, investment drawdowns, and the threat of conditionality imposed by the US or other partners. India's response. New Delhi responds tactically, reviewing border deployments, ramping up intelligence collection on US-Pakistan deals, and quietly accelerating its own minerals and energy diplomacy with Western partners. China's game. Beijing watches closely, mapping resource moves for CPEC China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, recalibrating investments for minerals and energy, and bolstering its own port and pipeline plans where needed. Afghanistan's dilemmas. Kabul, increasingly boxed in by Taliban sovereignty arguments, must rely on indirect channels for trade, energy, and technical assistance. Its footprint in regional negotiations shrinks as Islamabad and Washington drive new deals. Risk management and institutional mechanisms. Any strategic bargain of the current magnitude, resource, energy, and security, demands sophisticated risk management and new institutional mechanisms. In Islamabad, the government must engineer sovereignty protections, sunset clauses, and verifiability standards to pacify domestic politics. In Washington, the administration must assure Congress, intelligence agencies, and the public that engagement is justified by measurable returns and is not a strategic liability. The establishment of joint working groups across minerals, energy, trade, and counterterrorism is essential. These bodies handle operational coordination, technical dispute resolution, environmental monitoring, local employment uplifts, and ensure that both sides have levers to enforce contract compliance. Crucially, conflict resolution is harmonized with global arbitration frameworks to reduce the risk of local bottlenecks or politicized litigation. Dispute scenarios are rehearsed. What happens if payments stall, regulatory reforms are rolled back, or targeted joint security operations are leaked to the press? The answer is always layered: technical panels, political hotlines, phased privilege revocation, and contracts designed for reversibility. Historical precedents, learning from the past. Across the last 70 years, US-Pakistan bargains have cycled through warmth, freeze, reset, and rupture. The 1960s, US military aid and training countered Soviet presence but bred dependency and disappointed expectations. The 1980s, Afghanistan's war turned Pakistan into the central staging hub, with funds and weapons funneled through the ISI at enormous cost and transformational effect. The 2000s, coalition support funds and CT bargains faced breakdown over drone strikes, Abbottabad, and growing mistrust about Taliban safe havens. The 2020s, resource trade contingency bargains shaped by hard calculations and the rise, fall, and return of transactional logic. Each era underscores the need for robust implementation, periodic review, and the acceptance of strategic ambiguity at moments of transition. Scenario planning, contingency, opportunity, risk. If the current sequence of negotiations advances as planned, expect to see new mineral joint ventures registered under registry reform, public environmental impact processes, and staged investment flows from US lenders. Blocks awarded for oil and gas exploration, with Western technology and risk-sharing frameworks prominent in initial project announcements. Trade data showing increased Pakistani exports in textiles, minerals, IT services, and targeted agri-products to US and adjacent markets. Counterterrorism, joint operations mapped to regular review, with shared SOPs and incident audits. Energy projects progressing with evidence of regas installation, upgrades, and import substitution. These milestones will not make headlines, but will produce real effects, strengthening Pakistan's balance of payments, improving US supply chain resilience, and embedding new security contingencies in regional crisis management. Medium and long-term strategic impact. Strategically, the return to transactional realpolitik in US-Pakistan relations signals a broader recalibration of South Asia. Crisis management is no longer ad hoc, but embedded in technical mechanisms and resource flows. Resource and supply chain politics take precedence, creating new winners and losers among regional actors, local communities, and global investors. Institutional frameworks, joint working groups, arbitration panels ensure implementation persists across changes in government, posturing, or public sentiment. Narrative discipline and the logic of quiet power. Ultimately, the most lasting effect is the gradual normalization of silent, results-focused diplomacy. Political grandstanding, viral rumors, and rhetorical escalation are sidelined by tangible outcomes: trucks moving ore, rigs drilling for new resources, corridors opened for humanitarian or CT contingencies. Diplomatic dividends accrue quietly but have real-world consequences, providing stability, mitigating risk, and shaping the region's future far beyond today's headlines. Conclusion: the Silent Compact, Final Reflections. The September 2025 Oval Office scene, no press, waiting dignitaries, carefully managed optics, is the current punctuation mark in a long, restless history. It speaks to how leverage, necessity, and opportunity combine to produce far-reaching bargains in South Asia. Afghanistan's closure of Bagram forced realism. Pakistan's resource hunger and financial crunch refreshed urgency. Trump's transactional approach and Islamabad's willingness to engage set the terms. The deal, silent, reversible, measurable, defines the new logic. Sovereignty preserved, partnership managed, outcomes delivered when, and only when, mutual benefit demands. When the dust settles and history writes this chapter, it will be traced in the records of resource extraction, investment flows, emergency corridors, and the unpublicized but essential mechanisms designed to keep South Asia's balance from tilting toward crisis. The Silent Compact endures, not always visible, but always present, signing its name in minerals, markets, and moments of shared necessity.